Thank you guys all for coming here today. My name is David Rezapour. I'm an undergraduate anthropology student here. I'm in my fourth year at Berkeley. And the work that we're going to be looking at today was conducted as part of a URAP project under the supervision of Professor Rosemary Joyce and PhD candidate Lucy Gill, who we're lucky to have join us here today. All right, so without further ado, I'm going to go ahead and get into it. The rock art that we're going to be looking at was mostly collected through pictures as part of a survey on the island of Zapatera right here, on the northwestern corner of Lake Cocibalca in Nicaragua. And before we take a look at some of the symbolism and really get into the petroglyphs themselves, I'm going to start with a brief history of anthropological thought within the region, just to give you guys some context before we dive in. All right. So Zapatera Island right here is located in the middle of an area that's been commonly referred to by anthropologists as Greater Nicoya. The concept of Greater Nicoya was put forward first in the 1960s by anthropologist Alfred Norweb. And at the time, it was very much based in the logic of the culture area. Anybody familiar with the concept of culture area or have an anthropology background here? Okay, so I'll do a little brief explanation of that and why it's relevant for the petroglyphs we're going to be looking at. So a culture area basically was a concept. It was kind of a model of culture that predominated in anthropological thought during the course of the 20th century, which basically held a very static view of what culture looked like. And it basically dictated that individual members of a society or groups of a society sort of existed within a culture that just kind of happened upon them without a lot of direct involvement or innovation themselves. And in this view, it was possible to kind of create these very distinct maps. At the time, it was very closely wrapped up in colonial expansion of European powers and their kind of surveys of indigenous areas. And the motivation behind that was to create these geographical borders within which large groups of people could be said to have a high degree of affinity, and not just affinity, but homogeneity between themselves. And not a whole lot of change was thought to occur under this concept of the culture area outside of the occasional contact or influence with, say, another cultural area. And so in its original conception, the concept of Greater Nicoya was put forward as a kind of watered down culture area of some of the peoples which existed to the north of Nicaragua in Mesoamerica. And so for that reason, it was thought of as basically not much more than the southernmost extension of Mesoamerican culture and thought. A lot of the motivation behind this had to do with assumptions about what societies who are not necessarily organized around a central strict hierarchy are capable of. And so that really led anthropologists and non-anthropologists looking at this region to initially sort of classify a lot of the really remarkable things that they were seeing in the way of pottery, petroglyphs, statues, and other forms of material culture as basically only really explicable within the framework of some kind of contact with a more advanced civilization or an empire like the Maya or the Aztecs. Further evidence for the concept of Greater Nicoya as a Mesoamerican culture area had to do with since discredited ethnohistorical accounts, which were recorded primarily by Spanish missionaries almost a century after their original arrival into the area. And about 50 years after large die-off of indigenous populations as a result of violence and disease, and basically the contact which occurred as a result of Spanish arrival within the region. So these ethnohistorical accounts were basically compiled and they told a certain narrative about what happened within this region prior to European arrival. Those accounts were primarily conducted in supposed dialogue with two indigenous populations primarily, the Chorotega and the Nicarao. The Chorotega are a group which hail from Mesoamerica and are speakers of Otomangan-related language families, who were thought, based on these accounts, to have arrived within this region of Central America at about 800 AD, and that this migration basically involved the first step in a kind of displacement of the people who were there prior to them. And then this narrative was further carried along in conversation, or in the ethnohistorical accounts with the Nicarao. The Nicarao were speakers of Nahua language, which you maybe are probably familiar with, was the language of the Aztec Empire, and which the Center for Latin American Studies actually teaches classes in. And the idea here was that the Nicarao came in about a century before, so very closely before the arrival of Europeans, and basically finished the job of this migration and replacement of the people who were there prior to the Spaniards. And so since a lot of this evidence was initially used in support of the migration theory, a lot of the evidence has been basically reconsidered within the light of, first of all, really significant omissions of the ethnohistories and narratives which are told by other populations within the region, and as well as some of the kind of corrupt motivations behind sort of what interest the Spaniards had in basically constructing this narrative, and the vested interest there, as you might be able to imagine, was basically had to do with because within this framework it was possible to create a history of this portion of Nicaragua as being non-indigenous prior to the arrival of the Spaniards. Basically, the people who had a very centuries-long, deep-rooted history had been already uprooted. Then this provided justification for the colonization by the Spaniards. And this narrative continues to be repeated within Nicaraguan national politics and education and so forth. But some of the ethnohistorical accounts which have basically started to contradict a lot of this evidence have to do with speaking to other groups of people who exist in the region, primarily speakers of Chibchan languages. A Chibchan language family group is basically a language group that at one point was extremely predominant within Greater Nicoya itself. It's now thought to be. And many speakers of the Chibchan languages are still in Nicaragua. It's primarily in southern Central America, as well as North and South America, and so the reinterpretation of this ethnographic evidence, and also it's important to mention there's also a big lack of ethnographic work that's been done, not just on these groups, but also in Nicaragua in general. Nicaragua is a region which is a country which has not been subject to a great amount of formal archaeological study compared to many surrounding countries. A lot of that has to do with ongoing assumptions about the case has already been solved, and a lot of it has to do with the political instability that's been ongoing for a century or so. Not independent of U.S. involvement. Let's just say that. All right, and then furthermore, so now there's been an increased push towards the later part of the 20th century and in the 21st century to try and reconceptualize what the concept of a Greater Nicoya even should describe, and it is thought to account for a much more diverse set of lifeways, peoples, and interests and communities than was ever previously considered. And this is really important for further anthropological research because it adds a lot of complexity to the type of story that's being told here. But it also creates an additional complication because it's not quite as easy to necessarily assign things that we're looking at, like this rock art or pottery or whatever it may be, to one particular culture, and that's kind of a good thing. So in the meantime, while this has been worked on, there has been this lack of research, but at the same time, researchers within neighboring countries have continued to think about what's going on here, and actually last year there was a publication which was released, which is probably the biggest publication on which summarizes archaeological evidence from a more standard perspective in the 21st century, which basically has been released to date on Greater Nicoya in general. Large parts of the eastern side of the country, for political reasons largely, have been subject to even less study. And so in this book, which is written by a number of archaeologists hailing from different subspecialties within the field, has basically put forward an alternative to the concept of the culture area. That's really important because it's been pretty easy in the latter part of the 20th century to criticize the model which the culture area puts forward, but it's been much more difficult to actually propose a concrete alternative to it which can be used. And so the concept which is basically used by these researchers in this recent publication is the concept of the constellation of practice. And the constellation of practice is important here because it accounts the affinity in material culture which is observed between different groups is no longer necessarily explainable as evidence of homogenized shared cultural identity, but in a much more limited way is thought of as, at the very least, evidence for some form of human interaction, whether it be trade or competition or any other number of conceivable human interactions that might take place. And this is where some of the shared practices and shared ideas start to come about, but in a much more nuanced way than the concept of the culture area as one homogeneous boundary accounts for. So this is all really important. It creates a bit of more complexity when we're looking at these petroglyphs in particular. It's going to be hard now and in the future to pinpoint who the exact creators of the petroglyphs were. Research that's been conducted concurrently on Lake Osiwoka and Ometepe Island, which is right here, very close. It's the largest island on the lake, has suggested basically for a much more increased influence of these Chibchan speaking populations, which which lived in the region much more widespread prior to European arrival, and which were subject to a lot of brutality, which resulted in the decline of their population, although they do still exist in the region. And this is one of the avenues for future research, which is a much more detailed and sincere attempt to actually conduct ethnographic research with a lot of these local populations. And so not only does the difficulty of basically ascribing, okay, we can say this one particular group were the creators of the petroglyphs, but also it makes it much more difficult to ascribe exact symbolism to the petroglyphs. That's important because a lot of what was observed before, throughout the 20th century and even well before that, in terms of the motifs that are depicted on rock art and on pottery and textiles, etc., was basically used as evidence for Mesoamericanization of the region, and so because it was possible within that framework to describe one particular group of creators with a particular cultural affinity, it makes it more difficult now because the image is so much more complex. And in a lot of ways, when we actually take some time to look at some of the symbolism, we're going to do it in a very reserved way, but we'll get to that part. And in the meantime, we're going to move on to some more general rock art concepts which are going to be useful, as well as a brief description of some of the thinking on modes of production of rock art in particular. All right, let me get to you. So rock art is generally divided into two initial categories, additive and reductive rock art. Additive basically describes rock art which has been created through the addition of some type of material, like paint or ochre or wax, something like that. And reductive rock art is generally created through some kind of process which involves a reduction on the rock face, which leaves a lasting impression. Beyond this, also it's important to note that these distinctions can get a little bit blurry. In many cases, it's not clear whether or not a rock art is necessarily one or the other. And in Nicaragua in particular, there has been some evidence of additive rock sites, and these are more well preserved in places like caves, and that's where they've been found primarily. But the rock art that we're going to be looking at today is much more out in the open, so it's not necessarily well understood if they can be strictly classified as reductive. But we're going to go forward with the concept of the reductive rock art, which is synonymous with the term petroglyph, because that's mostly what's available to us today, and future studies are going to basically have to prove whether or not there may have been other processes involved. And so strictly just looking at petroglyphs and the production of petroglyphs, this has also been something which is controversial within archaeology itself. The term pecking is a term that was basically widely applied to reductive rock art as an explanation of the technique that was used to create it. And it basically involves a concept of a two-part toolkit, kind of hammer and chisel, stone hammer and chisel. And this explanation was applied in a very widespread and sort of uncritical way, because there was a lot of assumption that this would almost naturally be the most viable way to produce lasting rock art, and it wasn't really substantiated by actual research. And it wasn't until the later part of the 20th century that more basically experimental and replication studies, where archaeologists try and replicate some of these techniques used, started to yield a basically different result. And the concept of this two-part toolkit fell out of favor to make way for something different. And that was basically the finding, which was developed in research mostly with Aboriginal populations in Australia. And this was also conducted ethnographically under their sort of guidance, that one of the more reliable ways of producing petroglyphs in general, and this had really implications for petroglyphs worldwide, was basically the use of small stones which kind of fit in the palm of a person's hand and are very moderately modified for the purpose of creating this rock art. And so, because there has not been a lot of consensus about how to basically, identify these kind of modestly modified stone tools, and because they fit in so, in many ways, seamlessly with the natural environment when archaeologists are actually conducting excavations, those two factors have combined to make it really difficult to identify stone tools within the sediment and layers of an archaeological site. And the reason that presents a kind of missed opportunity is because petroglyphs are notoriously difficult to ascribe dates to. And if it were possible to find the tools that were used in their production and associate a date with them, then that provides really strong evidence for some kind of date for the petroglyph themselves. But this is all basically to say that the petroglyphs of Zapatera are very difficult to ascribe a date to right now. Further archaeological study is going to have to look at some of these tools and other things like microscopic analysis of how the petroglyphs might have been created and associated materials to try and create a more colorful image of the timeline here. But in its current state, what we're going to be looking at is not very well understood in that sense. And so now I'm going to take a brief look at my involvement with the petroglyphs and some of the tools and that I used and the ideas which basically motivated this work. How am I doing on time? I don't want to run too much far over.
12:26.
Okay, great. So basically, the tools that I used were these charcoal pencils and charcoal paper, which for me, I was lucky to use them because they came naturally to me because I had used them pretty. I had used them a lot in high school. I was doing a lot of art at the time, and it basically what the charcoals do is they allow a person who's looking at the rock art to kind of make judgment calls about what they're looking at on a really detailed level. So when we're looking at just a picture, a blank picture of the petroglyph itself, it can be really difficult in a moment's notice to try and make all of these very detailed judgments about what you're looking at, which parts of it are the result of human manipulation, which parts of it might be the result of some kind of geological process. And so my role in this really was to take a much closer look and in a somewhat subjective way, make those judgment calls on a small level myself, so that I could try and bring out some of the motifs and shadows which are not as clear in just the pictures themselves. Let's see. And so the other motivation behind this is also to try and engage with the petroglyphs in general in a more humanizing and reifying kind of way that doesn't necessarily reduce what we're looking at to a set of numbers. And the reason that's in some ways different from a lot of research that's conducted on rock art in general is that a huge amount of energy in the field has traditionally been dedicated to basically creating these really complicated schemes of motif classification. So we have a fish here, we have a human here, and how many of those? And then you try and create some kind of map and pattern which doesn't really say a whole lot on its own without human interpretation of those numbers. But nonetheless, the idea is basically to try and create something which involves a little bit of interpretation, almost as an acknowledgement that interpretation is necessarily something that's going to happen when engaging with these past lifeways and the material culture, because they don't really exist in some kind of scientific numerical vacuum on their own. The other idea behind doing something like that is basically to produce tools for a community engagement. So when Lucy goes back to Zapatera Island and talks to local people, something like this should be helpful in, first of all, demonstrating a kind of qualitative engagement and also producing interest in general in other people who might have things to say about it and might be closed off to the types of techniques which have been traditionally applied, not just throughout the region, but in archaeological surveys in general. All right, I think that pretty much covers that. Let's see. Okay, and so now that we've gone through this, we can take a look at the petroglyphs themselves. Before we do that, I want to note that the top 3 petroglyphs are not from Zapatera Island. They were actually part of a separate survey which Lucy conducted in the Darien region of Panama. And they have a brief explanation that you can see right here. If you guys have other questions about it, then you can come up and talk to me or Lucy about it afterwards, and we can go through that a little bit. But yeah, for the sake of this presentation, we're going to be looking primarily at these petroglyphs from Zapatera. All right, let's take a look here. So this is the first petroglyph that you guys can see on the bottom left corner over there. Let me see. So this petroglyph is basically located in a central area on the island, which is kind of elevated from everything else. Zapatera is a volcanic island, and so it's really quite significant that there is this ring, basically, of petroglyphs, which is located at the top of the island, which can pretty easily be interpreted to have some kind of symbolic or ceremonial or ritual value. It doesn't seem like a coincidence that they were all carved at that particular location. As to what types of rituals and what types of ceremonies were occurring here, that's not really known. Again, the idea of Mesoamericanization of the area has not been eradicated completely, and there are still some researchers who like to put forward hypotheses about something like this that have to do with ritual sacrifice. But that's completely unsubstantiated by the evidence here. In fact, one thing that's really significant about it is that there's almost no signs of human habitation in that immediate area. And so these petroglyphs are frequented by the current locals of the island. And this is a site which is kept pretty pristine relative to some of the other sites on the island. And so that basically just provides further indication that there's some kind of ceremonial purpose going on here, although it's not currently very well understood. All right, now let me scroll down for a minute. Okay, so, and yeah, this is you can see that there's a kind of bird, a ground running bird over here. It's not well understood. I think Lucy and I at one point were trying to look into maybe what species, but it's very difficult to say just based off of these kind of etchings. But nonetheless, these depictions of animals in general are extremely important and common throughout petroglyphs here in Greater Nicoya and throughout the region in general. The other thing that's significant are these kind of spirals that you can see over here. There hasn't been a huge amount of research on the symbolism behind those spirals, but you can see that they're also very widespread. This is from a study that was conducted, I believe in the late 90s, by a researcher working on another archipelago within Lake Cocibolca. And those petroglyphs basically display a very similar spiral pattern to the one that you guys are seeing here on Zapatera Island. It's been suggested that maybe this is some kind of depiction of water or air or some kind of flowing thing, but it's not very well understood. Some researchers have suggested other interpretations, which we'll get to shortly, but nonetheless, it is one more example of how little at the moment is currently known about symbolism and the kind of reserved way that the reserved approach that is probably better off if we take in the current day and age. And let me see if I can scroll to the next one. Okay. So this you may have seen on the Instagram page. This is a petroglyph that was not located at that central region on top of the island, but is actually located along one of the footpaths, one of the many footpaths that cross through the island. And one thing that's interesting about that is that these petroglyphs basically almost invariably, when they're located just off of one of these footpaths, actually directly faces the footpath. And so that's pretty strong evidence that the footpaths themselves are very old and have been basically frequented by different locals of the community who come back to these sites and ascribe their own kind of significance and meaning into the images that they're seeing. And so in Lucy's conversation with people who were showing her this petroglyph, it was very strongly recommended to pour water over the top. And Lucy recounted that provided some source of initial hesitation because, in general, pouring water on top of some of these sites can can cause some kind of reductive damage to the face of it. But nonetheless, as you can see, the image was pretty strongly intact. And actually, when the water was poured over the top of it, it sort of came to life. And it was described to Lucy as basically, this is a fish. A fish is in water. We put water on top of it, and the results speak for themselves. That it was possible to see it in a very different way, with scales almost kind of shimmering, and these bubbles sort of emerging in a way that wasn't really visible prior to that. And when I was actually doing this drawing at first, I had omitted some of those details without knowing that story. And so to me, even though I was looking very closely, I had not seen these bubbles and some of these scales until they were explicitly described to me by Lucy. And then it became so obvious that I had to basically define them with some stronger shadows. But yeah, and so I think that pretty much summarizes what there is about this petroglyph. Let me go forward. Oh yeah, so another thing, this concept of a two-dimensional depiction of some kind of animal, or basically two-dimensional rock art, which is not exactly two-dimensional in its nature, but seems like it may have originally have been intended to be viewed as some kind of animation, is not unfounded by any means in archaeological surveys of other rock art throughout the world. A really famous example has to do with the bulls at Chauvet. I'm not sure if you guys are familiar with it, but yeah, very famous archaeological site of petroglyphs, and there's sort of a similar concept. If we have time, maybe I can play it really quickly for you guys, but it was basically not very well understood at first, until some kind of revised analysis was done. And these images, which are overlaid on the petroglyph, are, in this animation, basically just separated and then played over each other so that you can get an idea of the movement. And this type of thing became more obvious when researchers basically tried to apply the kind of natural lighting that you would see in a cave, compared to the artificial lighting that had been used for basically a lot of tourists to come and look at it. And with the flickering of the firelight, you can imagine that some of this movement became more readily apparent when looking at some of these images. And so yeah, that's just a brief little example of that. And then let's go ahead and move on. All right. So this you can see on the top, this animal is a crocodile or an alligator. It's not entirely certain what species, although in different surveys, which were conducted at Lake Osiborka itself as well, some researchers have proposed that basically human came. I have a quote right here. Human Cayman complex probably represents a shamanic tradition of ritual transformation. And so that's the assumption that has been basically run off with in some different circles as evidence of, again, it's kind of this push and pull. There's a little bit of a tension on the culture of on the concept of the culture area, which is very difficult to immediately eradicate. And so the idea behind ascribing basically shamanism and shamanic traditions when looking at a lot of this imagery has to do with the assumptions about basically culture area push and pull between Mesoamerica and South America. And part of the problem with that, first of all, I mean, when we're looking at this petroglyph, it's very difficult to even think that, because we don't, I mean, it's not obvious that this is a human Cayman complex. So this transformation is not obvious here. It could easily just be another animal depiction. But also the much deeper problem with ascribing this kind of shamanic tradition when looking at these sorts of things, when looking at, for instance, the spirals that we were looking at earlier, is that the concept of shamanism in general is one in anthropology which hasn't really stood the test of time. And it's in many ways kind of used as a sort of catch-all term for religions and cultures who basically don't fit within some of the other categories that we've basically described. And so in many ways, if there is some kind of evidence for shamanism, which at the moment, reading that into some of these petroglyphs, there really isn't the evidence for. That sort of analysis is gonna have to come as a result of much more detailed future ethnographic research, etc. This sort of pattern on the bottom is not well understood what this might be either. I'm going to be saying that a lot. But Lucy has some suggestion that it's possibly a depiction of weaving. Weaving is two-dimensional depictions of weaved textiles or fishing nets or other products are pretty common throughout Central America and Mesoamerica in petroglyphs. So it wouldn't be unsurprising. But it's, at the moment, there's not really a whole lot that can be said in terms of exactly what it's trying to depict. And I think another thing that's interesting about this petroglyph in general is that it's a little bit distinct from the others in the sense that most of the other petroglyphs really had much more diffuse spread in their patterns. And you could see these kind of etchings or carvings basically all over the rock face. But this one really stands out, and it really is pretty much limited to just these two very distinct images. And they're very localized, and so I sort of struggled in trying to capture the rest of the rock face and was kind of guessing on some of that there. But it's also possible that some of the sort of minute judgment calls that I was making in making not only this drawing but many of the others might just be artifacts from basically limited imaging, and so further imaging may provide further clues. But that's mostly what's going on there. And let me move on to this one. If it was possible, this is one of the more enigmatic of the bunch. It stands out from the others as well in the sense that it has really strong, defined geometric lines, and it's been suggested. It was suggested to Lucy by the locals who showed her this site that this was possibly some kind of map. Not understood what it may be a map of, or maybe some kind of plan, blueprint for a building, something. But nonetheless, when it was described to Lucy, it was described basically as evidence of some kind of outside influence. So the presence of an outside society. This is what was told at the time. Although of course it's not really understood if that's certifiably true But nonetheless, these are the narratives that are sort of circulating around the petroglyphs as people continue to interact with them in the modern day. Another thing that's sort of interesting about it is this is just a small observation of my own, but the kind of T shape that you see right here, which is very distinct and geometric in its nature, also you can see in the following petroglyph kind of repeats itself. And so for a lot of these images that we're looking at, like perhaps, although it can't be said for sure, perhaps this sort of T shape and perhaps the sort of spirals that we were looking at earlier, because they're reproduced throughout the region in such a consistent way, we can almost certainly infer that there was a kind of universal meaning that was ascribed to them, that they had some kind of common understanding about what these symbols really meant. Of course, not understood yet what they mean, but that's that. And I think this is another important example of basically reading into the symbols to see for Mesoamericanization of Greater Nicoya in general. There's one researcher who's been working since the late 20th century and continuing today has basically suggested that similar kinds of what are described as enlaced cruciform symbols might be reproductions basically of Mayan symbols, which are said to mean gold. And there are all kinds of complications there, which you can imagine. It's uncertifiable. In many ways, the cruciform symbol that you see here is reproduced in many different ways throughout the region, and this is just one sort of iteration of it, with very limited evidence, aside from some of this ethnohistorical research which was conducted by the Spanish missionaries centuries ago, that's exactly what we're looking at. And so yeah, this is as you can see, this was definitely one of the examples where the patterns that were carved into the rock face were much more diffuse, and so there's ongoing interpretation, and it's very difficult to say what might be going on here. Although this one did stick out to me as a leaf, but that's just my own little idea. And let me move on to this one. This, yeah, a lot of examples actually, now that I'm seeing, are really popping up along this theme of reading into the Mesoamericanization. And so this is a two-dimensional depiction, can almost certainly be said to be a two-dimensional depiction of some of these stone statue carvings, which were found in great numbers in Zapatera Island itself. A lot of them are still kept by local communities. A lot of them are still found within the landscape, and a lot of them were actually taken not just by researchers, but by basically, early antiquarians who were the predecessors to the field of anthropology in general, with an interest in collecting these types of things to take back home to the colonial homeland. And the exact value and meaning of the stone carvings themselves, which this is a depiction of right here, has also fluctuated throughout time. At one point, it was favorable to think of them basically as another iteration of the Mayan stelas, and these other types of stone carvings, which really are predominant throughout the region, and in different contexts, particularly in the Mayan context, are associated with kingship, and basically, being created to patronize some kind of king or hierarchy or ruler, and to symbolize sort of greatness. But there is no archaeological evidence in Greater Nicoya for the same kinds of ritual hierarchies that we see in those other regions. And so it's very difficult to look at something like that and to walk away with those types of interpretations. A lot of these faces are really common in petroglyphs in Central America in general, and it's not. This again points to another problem in terms of the quantifying analysis, because it's one example of something which doesn't fit neatly into the numbers. It basically has been, in some cases classified as, oh, this is a human face, in some cases this is a monkey face, or this is some kind of animal face. And so those schemes become really unhelpful when you're trying to track the numbers of each. But nonetheless, when Lucy was guided to this spot by the locals, this was described as a monkey face. And that's most, I think I have, oh yeah, here's an example of those Nicaraguan basically stone carvings, which this one was collected by a very unethical researcher named Carl Bolevius on Zapatera Island itself. I believe these are from Zapatera as well.
Yeah.
Yeah, and they're housed in a national museum in, I believe, the city of Granada. Okay, great. And so, yeah, I think this pretty much concludes most of the analysis of some of the symbolism that I was going to look at. In general, future research is likely to produce a lot more insights and result on some of the things that we're kind of taking these initial impressions of right now. Significant barriers to research in general have been really ongoing political instability, and it's almost certain that the further ethnographic research, done in basically a reimagined way, could have really untold implications for some of the conclusions that are going to be basically ascribed going forward. And a lot of that boils down to the style of research. Community-based research in general is where the focus is trying to be at the moment. Although even in the recent publication on the archaeology of Greater Nicoya, there was a real lack of emphasis on that kind of community-based research. But Berkeley in particular, Lucy in particular, and Professor Joyce in particular are really focusing a lot on that type of approach. And so we'll see what becomes the result of that sort of thing. And I think that pretty much summarizes it for me. So I want to give a big thank you to Lucy for making this all possible and giving me the opportunity to conduct such fascinating work with these petroglyphs. Thank you to Janet and Julia. Julia, who's not here, they were basically instrumental in putting together this exhibit, and the Center for Latin American Studies for hosting it. So thank you guys for coming. And if you guys have any questions, we can sit around and talk about it. I may not be that useful, but Lucy's here, thankfully, so we can do what we can. Yeah, thank you. All right. Any questions?
How were you down there?
Oh, I didn't.
You have not?
This survey was conducted by Lucy, and so if you want to speak to that, yeah.
Yeah, sure. So this project actually started during COVID because, trying to figure out ways for students to get involved in the project while we couldn't actually go. And as you may know, it's been quite difficult to do research in Nicaragua since 2018 in particular with the regime. But yeah, so this research was conducted, the Zapatera survey was conducted in 2017 and 2018. But I was working there since 2015 and have spent about 2 years in the country, like total, 24 months.
So you did the drawings from the photograph?
The drawings were all based on the photographs, yeah. And for some of the images, there was maybe one photograph that I could use as reference. For some of the images, there were a couple of photographs from different angles, and so those were really helpful in trying to see what shadows were natural and what, I can basically think of as actually being carved into the stone face, but yeah. Any other questions?
If these are based on photographs, how did the water pouring over the fish image work?
It's a good question. I just had told you about the story, right? And so in recounting the story, you were then able to look at the image sort of with that information that was conveyed.
You never saw it with the water?
I never saw it with the water pouring over it initially, and that's why I had that trouble at first in seeing so much of it, because to me it looked quite faded until we had that conversation about it, and I was able to see some of those other aspects which were highlighted by the water pouring. So yeah.
But even the story, right, that's like the power of story, that even without the actual action, that story was still able to provide some of the effect. So.
I was just gonna ask, are there any accounts of Spaniards when they arrived, commenting on these, petroglyphs, or saying, oh, I don't know, I noticed, the symbol that looks like a cross, sort of, did they ever say, these
Actually,
people are drawing crosses?
Yeah, so I'm not sure about exactly within Nicaragua itself, but I know that these cruciform symbols, which were present in different ways throughout Mesoamerica and Central America, absolutely, that was the interpretation that was ascribed to them, that this is, the evidence of there was so much debate in Spain. This is a little bit of an aside, but there was so much theological debate in Spain at the time as to whether or not it was actually ethical to consider an entire population of people who had never come across Christ as having rejected Christ and therefore being, subject to damnation in the same way that Moors were, for example, because they clearly rejected Christ. But this was one of those pieces of evidence that was used in favor of the argument that, well, they did, because here's the cross, and etc. But yeah.
There's another petroglyph, not one of the ones that we chose, but that has some sort of animal, four-legged animal on it. And there have been the early explorers who visited this island in like 1850 wrote about it as like, this must be a horse, and this is actually a Spaniard riding a horse. Yeah, it is not. But there are colonial era petroglyphs in this country, right, that do depict things like horses, and their importance in indigenous societies here in North America. But yeah, that is not a feature of this kind of artwork.
You were mentioning in your presentation that there's even less research on the Atlantic coast, like for example the Miskito or like other indigenous communities. But I was wondering if there is some evidence of like I don't know, mobility or like travel and like connections between different indigenous communities.
Absolutely. I think part of the original assumption that was built into these culture areas like Greater Nicoya initially was that sort of dialogue or travel or omission of these boundaries basically didn't happen. But we can almost certainly like assume that is the case. I'm not sure myself of what the exact details of that are, but it's definitely going to be an avenue for further research, in particular because so little work has been done ethnographically, archaeologically on the eastern side in particular. Yeah.
Yeah, so just to build on that a little bit, so on Zapatera Island itself, there is no evidence specifically for interaction with the Caribbean coast. However, there is lots of evidence of interaction with various groups up and down the Pacific coast, as well as the region today called Chontales in the middle of the region. And before starting this project, I worked on a project in Chontales for several years. And in that region, we do find lots of evidence for ceramics that were exchanged with the Caribbean coast. So there hasn't been, most of the research has focused on ceramics. And so that's sort of our best evidence so far, but hopefully there will be other sources of evidence too that can sort of highlight some of these relationships.
All right. I think that if anybody has any further questions, I think that pretty much concludes it. But yeah, come up to me after if anything else pops up or yeah, at the moment, just let me know. Thank you. Thank you guys for coming.